Hey everyone, welcome to week 3 of the Bible Exposition class. This week we begin to look at the biblical text and our hermeneutical method, our way of exegesis, of interpreting the biblical text, and we begin that this week. And so this week we talk about the cultural historical method of interpretation. Now what this is we must understand that the document, whatever document we're looking at, was written by a particular person for a particular audience or particular people in history at a particular time in history. And you put all of these things together and they help us then to interpret what the original author was trying to say to these people. So there are circumstances and scenarios. There are things happening in our worldview that is different than ours. There might be phrases that are used that were specific to the writer and the audience, and all of those things. We aren't the intended audience of the documents. We're kind of a third party looking, and so we must look to see how those were put together. My professor in seminary says we must live, if we're looking at the New Testament, we must live with 1 foot in the first century and then 1 foot in modern times. We still need to look at the cultural historical context, but we also need to translate that into our common day life and our experience. We'll eventually answer some of these questions, but here are some of the areas that will drive our questions and observations of the text. Again, we want to begin with, as we talked about last week, our first step is to begin to ask questions of the text, to ask questions of what we understand, what we don't understand, and then to get clarification, to look them up and to find the answers. So as we engage with biblical text, most passages are going to have both a historical context and a cultural context. And we must understand that sometimes both of those are happening at the same time. An example here is Revelation chapter 3, 14 through 22. To the angel of the church in Laodicea, write, the Amen, the faithful and the true witness, the beginning of creation of God says this, I know your deeds, I know you are neither hot nor cold, I wish that you were hot or cold, so because you are lukewarm, and neither hot or cold, I will spit you out of my mouth. Because you say, I am rich, I have become wealthy, and you have need of nothing, you do not know that you are wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked, and it goes on. The point being is, there's both a historical and a cultural context. The historical context is, what is this church, right? This church that John is writing to has a history. John probably has a history with this church. God has a history with this church. These being the words of God to the church, then are saying, I know your deeds, right? And then all of these aspects of God's relationship with them. I am rich, I have become wealthy, I have need of nothing. Right, and so there's historical context there. Who is this church? And so we must first understand that this is being written to a particular church in the first century. Oftentimes, especially in Revelation, these things become symbolic, right? They're interpreted symbolically of, this is how we can apply it to our own lives. But in order to apply it to our own lives, we first must understand where this church was. Why is God sending this message to this church in the first century? What was really happening? What's the history of the church? And then, it goes on. It says, I advise you to buy from me gold refined by fire. And so there's some instruction by the Lord. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and dine with him and him with me. He who overcomes, I will grant him to sit down with me at the throne. Here is often a passage that is taken out of context here, not understanding that it's written to this church. Now, there might have been a cultural understanding of I don't know, in the time of knocking on the door and welcoming the stranger in, and these things that we don't get now, right? So there's a historical context that's an actual city and an actual church, and then some historical context or cultural context of the language that is being used. In addition, the cultural context of knowing Jesus, right? And so as he's saying that God is the one that disciplines and reproves. God's the one that corrects. If we open the door, God will come in. If we keep him out, he'll stay out. So this history of cultural relationship with God, who is God, right? And if I don't understand the kind of the God of the Bible, then I might misunderstand these verses and these passages to this church. All this is, and every passage is going to have both this historical context. It's an actual people living at an actual time, and a cultural context, things that make sense to them that might not make sense to us, because we are separated culturally from that time. Oftentimes there is an emotional or social impact to what's written. So we see the parable, the Good Samaritan, that we have the person laying ill at the side of the street. Jesus tells this parable, and the religious leaders walk right by him. The religious leaders don't stop to help this person. They walk right by him. The person who does stop to help this person is the Samaritan, the person that... And so in order to understand the impact of that story, of that parable, we must understand this historical and cultural context, the history of the Samaritan people and how the Jews didn't like them, right? Because they didn't see them as righteous and holy, because they had kind of intermixed with the Gentiles. A region of area where they would avoid intentionally because they didn't want to come in contact with these Samaritans. And so all that historical context. And this cultural context, that in order to understand the impact of Jesus' story, we must understand that cultural disgust of the Samaritan people, right? And the Pharisees just going, like they're the worst. And for them to be the heroes in the story really takes a kind of a gut punch to the listener of the parables in the first century. Now we just see it and go, okay, I can try to understand the emotional impact that parable would have on the listener at the time. And oftentimes I have to translate it into something of our day in order to really understand that social, emotional impact. But once we understand the historical and cultural context, what was happening, who were the Samaritans, and we start asking some of those questions. Why would Jesus be telling them this story? What's the punch of the story? What's the impact of this story? What's Jesus really trying to say? How would the listeners hear this? What were the listeners expecting to hear? All of these things help us to understand that emotional point of the story, and then we can translate then that point or that impact or what Jesus was trying to convey into our modern language. So the historical cultural context then helps us to get to that. And then we can convey it in modern day language. Now there is a danger to doing a historical cultural interpretation of Scripture and reading things into the text that are not there. I have included the Pneuma video for you about dust. It's about discipleship from Rob Bell. Now that is an example where I saw this video in seminary, and I was actually in a discipleship class reading first century documents, understanding the first century culture, what was discipleship all about, and then we watched this video, and the things that he says aren't accurate to first century Jewish culture. So one of the things he says is talking about how the rabbis would go and find the people that were the best. Well, that's actually not true. What we see was Jesus actually goes to people to invite them to follow him. However, that was not the normal practice in the first century. The normal practice in the first century was that people would go to the rabbi and go, "Rabbi, can I follow you?" Now, at that point, yes, the rabbi would choose the best of the best and say yes or no. But they wouldn't go out to people. And so that concept actually was after Jesus and probably started with the Jewish culture after Jesus, and maybe they started that. So what happens then is a lot of what Rob Bell is saying is really happening in the text of between Peter and Jesus. He's taking cultural, historical stuff of Jewish culture that is after the first century, documents after the first century, and then he's reading it into the text and saying, well, culturally that must be what was happening. But actually, culturally, it's not what was happening in the first century. So that is a danger at times to do kind of read into the text, cultural, historical, which may not be there. So we want to understand the first century culture, the culture of whatever passage we're looking at. But if we were to take, say, something that was happening in the world at the time and read it into the text, it may not be there. For example, one of the things that happens, if say I would write a document to a church today, and say 300 years from now, they look at that document and they say, well, at that time, people did so-and-so. It was a normal practice for people to be untrustworthy and to lie to one another. And therefore, when this letter was written, that's what they're doing in the letter towards the church. Well, that's not necessarily true. Something that might be culturally true at the time, and at least help us to understand the document as being what is said, it doesn't necessitate that the document is embodying all the cultural practices of the time. Hopefully that makes sense. So we do want to understand the first century culture. However, if we read into the text a first century culture in order to get understanding, and we have to change the text slightly in order to make it say something that it might not be saying, that is the danger of the historical cultural method. So helpful, but there is a danger. So 3 questions we definitely want to ask when we begin this cultural historical context of a biblical passage. And that's kind of origin. The first question is when? When was this letter or document written? Where was this document written? And then finally, why? Right? And we could actually, this origin of the document. So when was it written? Where was it written? And why was it written? So where in the world, when, and then the why is like, was there something happening culturally that gives us insight into the reason it was written? So, for example, going back to this passage in Revelation, right? God's saying to the church of Laodicea, why was God saying it, right? We don't have all the context, right? We have some of it. We're saying, like, people are saying, I'm rich and I don't need Jesus, or I don't need God. But what else was happening that was causing that dynamic within that church? That was the reason God is saying this to that church. And so that would help us. Now, we may not have those details. That's another drawback of a historical method, is we might not have the answers historically. We might not know exactly what was happening at a church. And that's okay. We do our best. So those are the questions of origin. The next question we ask is of author. And so these questions are, who wrote it? And what was their intention in writing it? So who wrote it, and what was their intention? What was the purpose? What were they trying to get the audience to feel, think, respond to? Behavior, whatever it is. Oftentimes in the letters of Paul, what we see is he's writing it to a church that he knows. He already knows the church. He knows the history of the church. And his intention of writing it is to get them to change, correct, to solve a conflict within the church, something, right? And whatever that purpose is, then helps us to understand why he's writing, what he is writing to the church. Another helpful thing to take into account when we talk about cultural historical method of interpretation is cultural worldview. Now we talk about worldview. Worldview is how we see the world, how our perspective of the world, what we think of the world, what we feel based upon the world, our judgments, our morals, all of that is our worldview. It's how we see the world, our perspective of the world. Now, that outlook on life and outlook on the world, again, in the first century, or even prior to the first century, is going to look much different than maybe our outlook today. For example, if I were to read in, say, in Revelation, and I read things and I go, oh, like he's talking about these beings who are, bringing judgment on the world. All those are helicopters, right? Well, what I did then is I took my cultural worldview and understanding and said, oh, what John was saying was helicopters, and I put it in the text. I must understand his cultural worldview at the time, and not necessarily read my cultural worldview into that. Part of the understanding the cultural worldview is how would the audience, the intended audience of the document, how would they have received the words of the document? So we might say, well, the author has an intention or a purpose of writing the words. Well, how would the intended audience hear those words? How would they receive those words? What would it have meant to them? And so in this, we can start talking about societal structures. What was marriage like? What were families like? What was the roles of men and women in culture? Physical features, transportation. How did they get around? What did that look like? Economic. How did they make a living? What was a daily wage? What were issues of poverty at the time? Political climate. What are the political structures in play? What are the powers? Who's in control? There's sections where we have prophecy in the Old Testament that is written to Israel, and yet the Jewish people aren't in the Promised Land. It's actually written in a time that they were in exile. They're in a foreign land. And so we must understand that, because how they receive those words is going to be different than if they were in the Promised Land. And so we must understand all of these dynamics and behavior, dress, customs, some of these. Now, these are things we can look up. There are books out there, and we can do research, and we must do research to kind of understand how they might be receiving these words. And there's a limit to that research, right? We could be cultural historians, right? And people have their doctorates in that. We don't necessarily need all of that information to understand kind of some of the culture and how the audience would have received it. Some of it's helpful, and we rely on those people who have done that good work. The last aspect of cultural worldview that is helpful is what would the audience, the received audience of the letter, what would they have understood of themselves and of God, that relationship between them and God? How did they see God? How did they understand God? How did they see themselves in relation to God? What were their religious practices, their convictions? All of that is helpful to understand how they would have received the letter written to them, or the words written to them. Oftentimes we read our understanding of God or our social understanding of self into the text, and we do not want to do that because that might not have been the cultural worldview at the time. And so those are things of cultural worldview to consider and to take into account. When we think about historical events that are happening at the time, that might help us to understand the passage. And like I said, that might be exile. Are they in the land or outside of the land? Is this a first temple, in terms of Old Testament, is this a first temple or second temple period? Even looking at maps will help us or if there was historical events happening in the world that may influence their perspective. So all of those things are very helpful for us in terms of historical context. We talked about a little bit last week of one way of engaging with the text is doing word studies, right? And so we look up a particular word in the Bible. How is that word used in context? How are they using the word? What do they mean by that particular word? And oftentimes with historical context, when we begin engaging with the historical cultural context, that helps us to inform maybe certain words or phrases. Maybe there are certain words or phrases that are used that have significance in that culture at that time that don't mean the same anymore. Language is constantly changing, and how we use words and what we say. For example, if I were to say, I can't wait for that home cooked meal. That's kind of a phrase that a lot of people in the U.S. would say. I don't know if other cultures necessarily use that phrase, but it means something, right? Culturally, it means a particular type of food. It might, the idea of home. What does home mean? Who's cooking the food? All of this, right? And so oftentimes if you said that, you don't have to explain all the details to anybody. If you said, I just need a home-cooked meal, everyone goes, yeah. Right, they understand something about the words and the phrases that aren't actually in the words and phrases. And so that often happened in the letters, right? How they received the words and what they saw something that they understood something that isn't necessarily written there. And so as we do the historical cultural context, we understand that this is how they would have received those words. This is how people in the culture at the time used these words. And so oftentimes doing the word studies helps us to understand these things. And words can have a range of meaning that we can understand. Oftentimes in a sermon or a teaching, people talk about the word shalom, right? And in the Old Testament context, literally I could say, it means peace. Well, then I can say, I don't understand what peace is. I know what peace is. I know what that means. But we must understand the Jewish culture at the time and how shalom means much more than it means wholeness and completeness and internal peace and external peace and all of these things. It's this state of well-being. We don't necessarily get that from translating the word to peace and then go, okay, I know what it means. We must understand the culture at the time. What does shalom really mean to them? What are their expectations? What are their hopes in regards to that particular word or phrase? How would they have received that from the original author? And so sometimes those word studies will help us to get to maybe the author's intent and how the original audience would have received those words. Now, a few things just generally about biblical culture that is much different than our culture, especially in the U.S. Right, the biblical culture across the board, Old Testament, New Testament, is a shame and honor culture. So a lot of things based on this shame and honor dynamic. It's interesting if we look at the crucifixion. So if we look at the cross, here's Jesus on the cross, and oftentimes in the U.S., we focus on the pain and the suffering and how much it would have hurt, right? Well, the focus of the biblical text isn't the pain and the suffering of Jesus. It's the shame. It's the people still don't recognize who Jesus is. It's the insults given to Jesus. And so it's that shame and honor dynamic that is really focused on in those passages. If we miss that about the first century culture, then we miss those words and we start talking about how much it's painful and suffering certain things are important for our relationship with Jesus and all of that. So shame and honor. The next one, corporate versus individual, right? And so the biblical text often is focused on group mentality, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, right? It's about family and those family group dynamics rather than the individual. In the U.S., often we're focused on the individual rights and the goals of the individual, the dreams of the individual, and so we often miss that corporate family group dynamic that is evident in both the Old Testament and the New Testament. We think the culture was very patriarchal, so we have men who kind of rule and do everything. They're the focus of the culture, and women are generally in the first century pushed aside. If we don't understand the patriarchy of the first century, then we'll miss that in the biblical text, some of the first ones to be to the tomb of Jesus are the women. Now we could just say, well, that's just what happened. But it gives light into the credibility of the story that we have of the crucifixion and Jesus and the disciples. Why? Because if they were to create a story, a fictional story of the ending of Jesus, they'd said, well, it didn't turn out the way we wanted to, so let's make it up. Let's make all this up. They would not have made up the women going to the tomb first, because that makes all the guys look bad. It doesn't make sense that they would make it up. So the fact that it's written that way shows us something about what the author is trying to say about women and their significance in going to the tomb first. The prodigal son, that whole dynamic of when the prodigal son asks for money, he's basically saying, Father, you're basically dead to me. I want the inheritance early. Now, if we don't understand that culture of inheritance and the blessing of the firstborn son and all of that, we miss that significant hurt and separation between the son and the father. So all of these things help us to understand the corporate dynamic, the family dynamic, the hierarchy structure of the family, then help us understand the biblical text and why it's saying what it's saying in the impact. Another dynamic to help understand is this. Oftentimes today we make a distinction between sacred, what is holy, and secular, kind of what is cultural. And we've made this distinction. Well, in biblical worldview, they don't have that distinction. There isn't secular and sacred. It's everything is sacred, right? Spirituality is much more lived out, right? So you have these sacred spaces. Worship is embodied, right? It's not like I go to church and I do my spiritual worship things and I go home and I live in culture. There is no separation. It's you're just living life, and as you live life, you have this relationship with God, and right. So that helps us to understand some of the things that do happen, and maybe God's response to people in the biblical text, or maybe the what the author might be saying. So that distinction between secular and sacred doesn't necessarily exist here in the biblical text. And for example, belief in one God, especially in the Old Testament, a belief in one God wasn't normal, right? So we could say now it's like, yeah, a lot of people believe in one God. Well, in the Old Testament, that was not a normal practice. So for the Israelites to go, we believe that there is one God, only one, that was radically different, radically outside of the worldview and paradigm. And so we see some of those things and we go, oh, this is why this is happening, or their experience in Egypt and all of this, because it was radically different. So we must understand some of those things. Another one that's helpful is kind of this area of justice. Slaves and household servants, we must understand a lot of time what we see of slavery in the Old Testament, New Testament, are kind of servants. Now they could be bond servants. They could have been they owe a debt, and so they're servants until they pay off the debt. It could be that they don't have a debt, but it's kind of a job, They give themselves to a household to be a servant because, hey, they like the household. They're treated well. It's part of their job, and they give their life to that, right? And so we must understand that even the bondservants and slavery looked different in the biblical view than it does now. And so if we see some of that, we go, oh, see, the Bible, it it validates slavery. Well, no, it doesn't. It was a totally different cultural context, historical context at the time. Poverty, as we see poverty in the biblical context, was much more a result of bad choices of people. Losing money and losing status. And so it was much more kind of a response of people than it is today. Oftentimes today, we could have the worldview of like, oh, they're poor because they made bad decisions. Maybe there's a lot of systemic cultural issues now today that cause people to fall into deep poverty, and it's not because of any choice that they made. Well, in the biblical text, more than not, that is the case. And so when we see Jesus preaching to the poor and focusing on the poor, there's this. It's not just some things happen to you culturally and that's why you're poor and that's why I'm going to preach to you. I mean, he's preaching to the poor, and these are the people that made bad decisions, right? That lost their money, that got into addiction, and he's saying there's hope for you, right? The kingdom of God is for you. The ones that life is just kind of not going well. And so when we understand that context, it helps us understand what Jesus is saying and why he's saying it and how they would have received it. It also helps us understand some of the frustration of, say, the religious leaders or even some of the disciples in who Jesus is talking to and why Jesus is talking to them. There's a moment where Jesus is talking to a woman, and the disciples are like, why is he talking to a woman? Like, culturally, that is not a normal practice. What is he doing? So when we understand that, we understand kind of how Jesus is breaking those historical cultural barriers. And so all those are helpful as we interpret the text to see what is really going on. Another one, meals were often in Jesus' time, they were eaten sitting on the ground. There wasn't tables and chairs like we have today. And so when it says at the Last Supper, we have John who's laying on Jesus. Well, they were all laying on each other, right? Kind of on the ground, resting on the ground. That was a normal practice. You wouldn't be like, this is weird. Why would John be laying on Jesus? And so we look at the historical context and we say, well, no, John just happened to be next to Jesus, right? That was what was happening. He's next to Jesus and they're just next to each other. They're all kind of like sitting on the ground. The washing of the feet of guests, some cultural, historical practices of the household. Those are helpful to know as we look at a lot of different passages. And the naming of children is another one. Naming of children in the biblical worldview was intentional. Names had meaning, and that meaning the name and the meaning carried with them. Now today we just like a name and we just choose a name. And we don't necessarily look at the meaning of the name. But names and the meaning of names were very important to the biblical worldview. And so we must understand all of that cultural context in order to understand, why someone would name their child one thing. Or, oftentimes in the Old Testament, why does God change someone's name? Well, that's significant. God giving them new purpose, new meaning to their life in the new meaning of the name. So, again, as we look at cultural, historical context, it is helpful for us to, that being the first step, after we ask questions of the text. So again, the first step is to look at the text and create a list of questions, ask questions. But as we engage in those questions and answering those questions, we want to start with the historical, cultural context to find out what we're missing about this, to begin understanding why the author would say something and what they're saying. So there's an overview of the historical context. I've added some videos. Make sure you turn in the assignment, and I will see you next week.